Okay, this is gonna be my last journal entry. I'm on day 8, meaning I've completed one total week in the woods. The original plan was to go until Sunday. However, the school is opening up today, and I'm out of clean clothes, so I figured that's a good reason to go in, 12 hours early, something like that. And yeah, today was raining very heavily, and which is kind of strange because the whole week it didn't rain, it didn't snow, fairly good weather, and then it started to rain and pour the day that I was planning on leaving. And then yeah, now that I'm trying to make the video, it stopped raining. What a coincidence. So in this entry, I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to teach you or something like that. um, the only thing that I'm trying to do at this moment is, one, document it for myself, and two, um, I guess just share my testimony of what I've learned um, with that. And so I'm gonna talk in somewhat arbitrary terms, and like I said, the reason I'm doing that is because this series of videos is not really meant to share my story per se. It's more of to share this specific experience of going into the woods with no distractions for a week, like just a solid week, which I think is pretty doable for pretty much anybody, because people get like 2 weeks vacation time at least, and if you're in school like I am, you're gonna get even more than that. So like, this is during spring break that I'm making this. And yeah, so on the first the first 3 days I went down to West Virginia, to Appalachia, and it was a very racist place, just in general. I mean, you could kind of tell just by being around the town. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to leave that small little country town in West Virginia and come back to where I'm staying now in Ohio. And so first 3 days I spent there, and then the last 4 or 5 days I've been out here in Ohio. And I think that's significant because in the first 3 days I went to a place. One, it was about 20-30 minute drive until you get cell service. So say if something happened, you'd have to drive 30 minutes just to call the police, in other words. And that's assuming you're driving. Like, say if my truck would have broken down, I wouldn't have been able to call a tow or call my parents or call friends, anybody, um, until I would walk, I guess, however long it takes somebody to walk a 30-minute drive, which is probably the whole day. And so I always had that in the back of my mind. And then it was, from my experience, it was a very hostile place. So what it did is it put me in a position where I was kind of, the best words I could say is backed up into a corner, because all of the things that I had, like, for example, calling the police, something simple, basic like that, was no longer an option. And yeah, of course, I had my 357 Magnum, I had my 9 mil on me, but at the end of the day, if it's like my friend was saying, if it's multiple attackers and all I have is a pistol, especially at night, ambush, like, it's unreasonable to think, well, it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be good, put it in those terms. And I knew that. And I was also alone. It's not like I came with, somebody else to watch my six. You know what I mean? It was just me. And so basically, when I went out to the campground, there was no cell service. I didn't have no music downloaded. I didn't bring a speaker. I didn't bring headphones. I wasn't planning on watching movies, whatever. I just wanted to go out there and just basically examine myself. And it was a excellent place to do so. And in those 3 days, I realized a lot about myself. And I think the biggest takeaway that I could explain to you guys is the utter need that every human being has for God. And what I was doing in my life, like I said, I'm just talking about myself. I'm not talking about anybody else except my personal experience. What I was doing is, even though I'm a practicing Catholic, I was replacing God with different things throughout the day. And what that means practically is, even during prayer, the time that I was spending solely focused on Him was almost non-existent. And because of that, I was living a very brutish life where anger was the predominant emotion that I felt, because what that did was it separated me from, in other words, I just became an animal. I just became an animal where brute force and, being aggressive was the only, that was the only way that I knew how to operate. And I didn't know how to be, I'm still learning, to be honest, how to be charitable and how to be nice to people and how to treat, random strangers with respect. I've never really been good at that in general. And then much less with this vice going on in the background. And a lot of that was caused by me worrying about different things, like whether it be with my work, whether it would be with school, whether it be with my relationships, what have you. I was fixated on different things in my life. In other words, I was fixated on myself, in relationship to these things. And the reason that's a problem is because you're not, and this I'm talking everybody, you're not a sufficient cause for your own happiness. You can have all the joys, all the luxuries in the world, but just by the nature of human beings, it's simply not sufficient. And the only thing that is sufficient for the complete fulfillment of man is the contemplation of God specifically. And the more time throughout the day that we think of Him, the happier we're going to be. And that's not my opinion. I'm speaking in terms of fact here. This is no longer my experience. This is just what I have discovered during these 3 days. And then, it's easy to intellectually understand it, but it's another thing to play it out practically and to where you have experienced it and you know for a fact that this is how things operate. And it's okay. So, in other words, charity, love of God. And the more time you can think on Him and the more time you can ask Him questions and what have you, so charity, love of God. First 3 days, that's what I got. Now, the last 4 days were a little bit different. And they were different because in this campground that I'm currently in right now, I did have access to cell service and I could text my friends, what have you. But I realized the different attachments that I have that I didn't really realize until those first 3 days happened. So may that be with my work, with the job, using my phone too much, etc. I realized those issues because I saw them play out practically because I had no distractions and I was thinking of things that weren't even in front of me. I was thinking about weird stuff like my Instagram account when I have no cell service and there's no reason for me to be worrying about the Instagram right now. That's what I mean. So I realized my different attachments and how those attachments kind of were blocking me from loving God. Okay, love of God, easy enough to say, but how does one practically going about loving Him more, especially because love of God is something supernatural that only God can infuse in yourself. So you cannot be the cause of charity in your own soul. So it didn't really make sense to me. There was a line in St. Augustine where he was battling with lust, and then he had a vision of the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary told him to St. Augustine, why do you stand on your own strength and fail? And then he showed him the saints. She showed him the saints and said, look at how, these saints basically rely on God to solve their temptations and stuff like that. And sure, it was a beautiful message, but it didn't, I didn't understand it, because how could you rely on anything other than yourself? Like say if I'm sitting here and for whatever reason I start to get tempted, what can I do because the one who decides whether to fall into sin or not is me. So how can I delegate, for lack of a better term, that temptation? You know what I mean? Like it didn't make any sense to me. And it was only until these last 4 days where that started to make sense. And this is what I got. When a temptation happens, and I'm not just talking about the 10 commandments, yes, I'm talking about that too, but I'm talking like just little anxieties, like say for example the Instagram account, where I was worried about what people were thinking of me on the Instagram account. It's hard to just eliminate those thoughts, you know what I mean? You can't just be like flip the switch and be like, okay, I'm not thinking about Instagram no more. But here's what you can do. In those times when you get these thoughts, instead of trying to reason yourself out of them, instead of trying to look in third person, instead of trying to do all these weird nonsensical things, the thing to do is to just turn to God in prayer, no matter how large or how small the temptation may be. And I'm talking specifically with these small little anxieties, these small little worries that really have no substance. So in that current situation, I would just say a prayer real fast, or I'd repeat it multiple times. Hey, my God, I perfectly trust in thee. My God, I trust you. My God, I trust you. I'll just repeat that, repeat that, repeat that. And then naturally, because the mind is fixated on God, the mind cannot be fixated on God and the world at the same time. It's either or. So what I believe the Virgin Mary was talking about is that in these temptations and stuff, you're trying to fight the temptations by focusing on things in this world, and that includes yourself and your own reasoning. So you see, when I turned to God in prayer, I wasn't reasoning. I wasn't saying, oh God, like, how does this work? Which is good too, because you're still fixated on God. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in that prayer, oh, tree broke. In that prayer, it's just perfect trust in God. It has nothing to do with the temptation at all. It's the complete opposite of the temptation, because God and sin are complete opposites. But that holds true in every single thing in our lives. Okay, so what do we got? We got love of God, and then we got thinking of God, especially in our times of need, to have constant recourse to God. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. It doesn't matter if I'm watching TV, if I'm doing nothing, if I'm talking to somebody, if I'm at the store. It doesn't matter. Having that constant prayer throughout the day and trusting that He has you in His hands. Okay, so then I ran into the next problem. Okay, I know I gotta love God. I know I gotta trust Him. But I don't really trust Him. To be honest, just being fully transparent, when something is going wrong, it's very difficult to just be like, God, I know you're gonna handle this. That's not an easy prayer to make, especially when things are going very wrong. And so I believe it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, I went out into the woods just walking around, and then I basically asked Him, hey God, why am I in these woods? Why am I doing this like little experiment? Why all these questions? I just had so many questions. I just began to ask Him. And then throughout the whole time, what I learned was all the difficulties in my life, all the wrong turns that I've made, all the errors that I've made, all the close calls, every single one of them was somehow or another tied into the sanctification of my soul. So what happens is, the reason we don't trust God is because we see something that happens and we use that event as evidence for, okay, well, God might be trustworthy, but He's not applying, His grace to me. You know what I mean? Because that's what it comes down to. Like, objectively, I know that He's trustworthy, but in my life, I'm not applying that. I'm not applying that trust. But what I did when I looked throughout my whole life and the trajectory of my whole life, I came to understand that every seemingly wrong turn that I've made, somehow or another, led to my conversion into Catholicism and continued sanctifying me throughout the whole process. And then so if I had all these different issues, all these different problems, I wasn't having a very peaceful life, perhaps I would have not done this experiment, perhaps I would have not even converted because my life was peachy. Why do I have to worry about some imaginary deity if my life is going completely fine and completely satisfied? You see what I mean? But when things go wrong, when you start to suffer, when you start to get tormented another way, in other words, it kind of forces you to love God in terms of, I have no other options. I've exhausted my options, and God is my last option, and that's the position that I was put in. And that's where I want to leave this journey, these 7 days that I've been out here, is that I need to trust in Him. And the way I do that is just by repeating it. My God, I trust in thee. My God, I trust in thee. Even when I don't feel it, to do the prayer and to dispose myself to receive that grace. And I did that for the last couple of days. And what I found is my life has become very peaceful. Because whenever I get an anxiety, whenever I get a worry, all I do is give it up to God. Hey God, I trust in thee. I'm not even gonna be concerned with it. And if I'm trying not to be concerned, all I'm gonna do is focus on Him, and He'll take care of things. And I think that's why He drove me out into the forest, was because whenever I started getting these anxieties, specifically with any issues that pertained to the future, something that there's no way I could know, all He wants me to do is to trust Him. And that's it. It's as simple as that. There's obviously so much more into it, but that's the only thing that I need to worry about right now. To have perfect trust in God, and to believe that whatever happens is for my spiritual benefit, and that the perfection of my soul relies solely on Him, solely on the love of God. And as long as I constantly fight to predispose myself for a greater trust in Him and for a greater charity, then I'm going to be all right. Thanks for hearing me ramble.